Recruitment Part 3. There was, however, one Muslim group that was liable for the collection, and these were the Bosnians. The reason, according to the author of the laws, was that at the time of the conquest of Bosnia in 1463, the inhabitants had at once submitted to the Sultan and accepted Islam. When the Sultan offered them a privilege in return for their actions, they requested that they become subject to the collection. And since then, the Sultan had taken lads from that region. Most of these, the laws informs us, were allocated to the palace or to the palace gardens. The laws dates from the early 17th century. Nonetheless, since the cadastral surveys from after 1463 do show that there were many conversions in Bosnia following the Ottoman conquest, 18 its story of how the collection started in Bosnia does have some credibility. The areas where the sultans made the collection were the Balkan Peninsula and Anatolia, with the former providing most recruits, presumably because it was an area with a majority Christian population. In Anatolia, the majority population was Turkish, and so not eligible. Furthermore, some areas of Anatolia seem at certain times to have been exempt. The author of the laws informs us that it was against regulations to collect lads from, for example, the area between Karaman and Erzurum, because they are mixed with Turkomans, Kurds and Georgians and Apos. Nor did the Sultan extend the collection to the Arab lands after their conquest in the 16th century. 19. These were the areas and populations that were subject to the levy, and the principles on which the officers in charge made their selection. Once they had chosen and assembled the lads, the next task was to bring them to the capital. The first stage was to organize the boys, according to the 16th century template, into groups of 100 to 150, or into groups of 200 according to the laws, and then to make a separate register for each group. For every lad, they should, according to the template, show his name, the name of his father, the name of his village and of the holder of the fief to which the village belongs, and a description of the boy, so that if he disappears, reference to the register will show who he is and where he comes from, so that he can easily be recovered in Apos. A purpose of the registers was also to prevent roughnecks joining the consignments of boys, and to prevent corruption on the part of those making the levy, for example, by selling their charges privately as slaves. Thus assembled, the lads traveled under guard to Istanbul, staying overnight in villages. The template decree forbids them to stay for more than one night in order to minimize the hardship to the villagers who provided food and shelter. Once in Istanbul, the escorts delivered them to the Aga of the Janissaries. The Aga had first to check that the boys who arrived in Istanbul tallied with those whose descriptions appeared in the registers, noting those that had fallen ill and any that had not arrived. As a further precaution against fraud, the decree required the officer in charge to make a second register, so that when he later arrived in the capital, the Aga of the Janissaries could compare the two registers, a process which would allow him to detect any falsifications. The laws describes the next stage in the proceedings. The two Janissary officers, subordinate to the Aga of Rumelia and the Aga of Anatolia, would appear with their clerks and, in the presence of the Aga, a surgeon would examine and circumcise each of the boys in turn. They would next allocate the best-looking lads to the palace. These were the ones who would receive an education in the palace schools 20 and sometimes, after serving the person of the Sultan, receive appointments to governorships or other offices. The physically strong ones they appointed to work in the palace gardens. This, too, could sometimes lead to a privileged position. The destination of most of the lads, however, was the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's personal infantry troops. Admission to the Corps was not, however, immediate. Whereas the good-looking boys received an education in the palace, the future Janissaries received an entirely different form of training. The first step was to sell each boy, traditionally, according to the laws, for 1 gold piece, to Turkish farmers in Anatolia. The payment was a token. It was to prevent these boys refusing to work, on the grounds that they were the slaves of the Sultan. They remained with the Turks for about 7 or 8 years. The reason for this practice was, in the first place, to accustom the lads, through regular farm work, to hard physical labor. For this reason, the laws insists, it was forbidden to sell them to judges or the learned, because these have no landholdings where the future Janissary would become accustomed to hardship. And Apos. Equally, it was forbidden to sell them to tradesmen because, instead of going to war, they would earn a living through craft, or to the people of Istanbul, because their eyes would be open wide by being in the city, and they would not suffer hardship in Apos. The second reason for the practice was to teach them the rudiments of Islam, through living in an Islamic environment, and finally to teach them Turkish. Before the large-scale admission of Turks into the Janissaries from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, very few members of the corps would have spoken Turkish as a native language. It was, however, the lingua franca of this polyglot body of soldiers, and indeed of the ruling elite of the empire, and its acquisition was essential. The supervision of the lads who were with the Turks was the responsibility of the Agas of Rumelia and Anatolia. Each of these had a staff of 10 to 15 men, who were responsible for the capture and sale of any who tried to escape. At the end of the period, they recalled the boys, who were by now adult, and allocated them a wage of an ox per day. The laws give 7 or 8 years as the period which the boys spent with Turkish farmers, but this was probably an average and not a precise figure. Rather, the Agas recalled the youths as vacancies arose in Istanbul. The next stage was not, however, to enroll the recruits into the janissaries. Instead, the officer known as the Aga of Istanbul allocated each youth to one of the 31 dormitories in the barracks of the novices near the entrance to the palace. These, the laws informs us, performed duties for the Sultan. It mentions in particular the transport of firewood to the palace, manning the vessel which brought snow from the mountains near Bursa to the Sultan's icehouse, and manning the vessels which carried troops over the Bosphorus to and from Üsküdar. In describing the duties of the novices, the author of the laws unfavorably compares the situation in his own time, when there were 12,000 novices, but only 12 ships, with the age of Suleiman I, 1520-66, when there were 4,000 novices and 72 ships. He complains, too, of the frequent loss of boats in his own day, as a result of unskilled seamanship. These were not the only tasks that the novices performed, and not all novices lived in the barracks outside the palace. Others served in the various imperial gardens or, for example, as palace laundrymen or cooks. A more significant number became apprentices in the naval dockyards in Istanbul or Gallipoli, where documents from the first half of the 16th century show them working as caulkers, carpenters, oarmakers, bombardiers, blacksmiths, pulley makers, and oakum workers. 21 The practice of employing them in the dockyards continued into the 17th century. 22 Records from later in the 16th century also record them working as blacksmiths and builders in royal construction projects, such as the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne in the early 1570s. 23 Others, on completing their service with the Turks, became apprentices in technical units of the army, such as the imperial gunners or the imperial armorers. These apprenticeships in dockyards, building sites and military units may, strictly speaking, have contravened the prohibition on the janissaries learning a trade, but the crafts which they learned were those which were essential to the prosecution of war, and so for the efficiency of the janissaries as a military unit, it was after their service as novices that the Sultan finally drafted them into the janissary corps. This event took place not on fixed occasions, but as and when vacancies occurred. Towards the end of the 16th century, the collection as a source of recruitment to the palace and to the janissary corps began to break down, and, during the course of the 17th century, collections became increasingly rare. After the early 18th century, they ceased altogether. The author of the laws, who composed his work in order to lay out for Ahmed I, 1603-17 past practice as a basis for present reform, sought changes in the method of recruitment to the janissaries as the source of anarchy. Later reform tracts, from the reigns of Osman II, 1618-22 and Murad IV, 1623-40 support him. In this view, exactly what replaced the collection as the source of recruitment to the palace is not clear, although some new entrants appear to have come from the households of great men. In the case of the janissaries, the pattern of admission to the corps is a little clearer. From the 14th century until the late 16th, recruitment was through the levy on prisoners of war or the collection. It was apparently only in the reign of Selim I, 1512-20, that the janissaries received permission to marry, and this permission applied only to retired men and some of the officers. Nor could the janissaries, as slaves themselves, legally acquire concubines. This limited the number of legitimate offspring, and so prevented the janissaries forming a hereditary caste. In time, as the ban on marriage became less stringent, it became customary to admit as novices the sons of janissaries who were capable of service on the ships and apos. These, however, formed a small minority. Lists of janissaries and novices from the 16th century 24 show very few of them with a Muslim father.